futures policy. I'm the new director of a new center for unusual collaborations. So for those of you who are not familiar with sociology, that's great because this is our mandate. We're trying to think of new ways to do science that is not so competitive and more collaborative, and trying to think about what that could look like. And that's sponsored by the rectors of 4 universities here in Holland. And finally, I'm working these little images, these 6 circles, as part of Robust, which is an EU project that we run on rural-urban relations. And this is really important because when I talk about rural sociology, as I'm going to tell you, it's always in relation to the urban. So we're trying to understand not just rural places on their own, but rural places as dynamic and interacting with local and global forces. And in this, we look at business models, infrastructure, food systems, cultural connections, ecosystems, and the synergies across these different themes. And we do this in 11 cities across, or regions across Europe. So that's my background a little bit. If you have, oh, well, anyway. So the principles for this lecture are, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. Let me know if I speak too quickly. I am very enthusiastic about community-based research and rural sociology, and I'm a native English speaker, and that means that sometimes I get a bit carried away. So don't be afraid to raise your hand if I'm speaking too quickly. And please, Dr. Aziza, just let me know, just interrupt me. And if something's not clear, sociology can be very complicated, confusing, and sometimes what makes sense in my head might not make sense in your head, so please let me know. And actively use the chat. It's even better if you want to raise your hand and ask your question with your video on, then I can see you. But I know that's a bit scary for some people. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I can be quite informal, so please take advantage and let me know your questions. Now, to practice, I would love to get to know a little bit about you all. So if you could use the chat function, if you have access to it, and tell me 3 words to introduce yourself. So I would say sociologist, food, and sustainability. You can be more exciting, like motorcycle driver, as I see from Bella. But just let me know who you are. And I will try and find the chat again, because I am not very good at this.
Okay. Students?
Students and everyone else.
Okay.
There's no wrong answer.
What is rural sociology? Food?
I know. Oh, sorry, hello?
Okay.
Yeah. So Bella isn't in, oh, a lot of food people, fantastic. Animal nutrition, which is basically food. Oh, relationship. So nice to see these coming in. A lot of food people, sustainability. I see a sociologist, sleepy.
Oh.
Well, then I absolutely understand that. You need to do some stretching. Now let's see. Okay. Well, as these come in, I'll keep monitoring them. And I'll move on to this idea of, or this question that I want to first cover to make sure that we're on the same page, which is, what is rural sociology? Dr. Aziza, is everything okay?
Yes, someone has unmute.
That's okay. Okay. So my first question, and I know some of you will answer from your keywords, but has anyone taken a social science course before? If you can use the raise hand button.
Semua bisa raise hand?
Pardon me?
Now,
Is there a raise?
yeah.
Oh,
Is
oh,
there
sorry.
any raise hand button?
Is there a raise hand button? If not, just put yes or no in the chat. Maybe we do that. Let me know if this is your first time taking sociology or not.
Have you? Students, have you taken a social science course before?
So for example, yes. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, so many. Okay. So if this is too easy, then let me know and then we'll move forward quickly. Oh, so nice. So it's really interdisciplinary group then.
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So how I define sociology is really as the study of human social relationships and institutions. And when I say human social relationships, then we're also understanding humans in relation to non-human objects as well. It's about understanding how human actions and consciousness shape and are shaped by social and cultural structures. So if that sounds difficult, you're not alone. I don't know if you're familiar with this famous physicist, but he said that on Twitter, so very scientific source, but he said in science, when human behavior enters the equation, things go nonlinear. That's why physics is easy and sociology is hard. Now, I wouldn't say physics is necessarily easy, but what makes sociology hard is that indeed there are no facts often. And it is nonlinear because our human behavior, the way we interact, if we go back to our definition, our social relationships and our social institutions are indeed nonlinear and a bit crazy sometimes. So I want you to take a moment to look again at this picture here with the crossways and ask yourself, how might a sociologist study this image? What questions might a sociologist ask? And what hypotheses might be tested? Again, no right or wrong answer, but I'm curious if I was to give you this image as I have, what questions you might ask if you're interested in studying human interactions and relations. You can also use the video and the voice if that's easier for you. Anyone brave enough to give it a guess? Where are my sociologists?
Okay.
Urban community, nice, yeah. Individualism, yeah. We might also look at the way that rules regulate behavior. We might question what about our society requires this kind of crosswalk, right? Is it giving priority to pedestrians? Seems like it. We might ask who follows the rules, these people in the middle here on the white lines, and those who break rules. Breaking rules is a very interesting field of sociology. So I give this just as a way to start to think what we call sociologically, or to invoke our sociological imaginations, which is a way of saying that when we study sociology, we're really trying to think outside of what we might take for granted. So even something as simple as a crosswalk can become a very interesting site of social study. Yeah. So many of you probably already know this, as we have a lot of sociologists, but topics addressed by sociology are very diverse. We study race, social and economic class, religion, family, the government, so the state, class, practices that people do around food, for example, but also geographic scales like urban and rural. And The other thing I think you really need to know about sociology is that we use sociological theory to explain social phenomena. So when we see something happen in the real world between people or between people and objects or people and institutions, we try and use theory to help understand and explain. And one thing that sociology often gets critiqued for is being about anecdotes or speculation. And when we move into the methods section, I want to really show you that sociology is much more than that we develop rigorous approaches and rigorous methods to ensure that we are not just presenting anecdotes, but that we can actually start creating empirical evidence to back up these theories or to test these theories or to prove or disprove these theories. And finally, my very favorite definition of sociology is that sociology is about challenging what's taken for granted. It's about challenging common sense. And that for me always involves looking at relations of power. And when we think about relations of power in relation to rural communities, I think we have a really interesting starting point. So if we now understand, if we now understand what rural sociology is, pardon me, what sociology is, then we can think what rural sociology is. So rural sociology is associated with the study of social structures in rural and remote areas. And this area of sociology tends to focus a lot on food and agriculture, natural resources, rural migration, but it's also very dominant in development studies and increasingly in the study of rural-urban relations. Now, if you have any questions thus far, please do let me know in the chat. Okay, so we have an understanding of sociology and an understanding of now what rural sociology is. But I want to step back and understand what is the rural from a sociological perspective. And I'd be very, very interested to know in your own languages what you call rural places, because this is a very, yeah, a lecture that's very biased towards English. So what is the rural? It's really the distinction between the city and the country. And the urban and the rural has a long history. So this distinction has been going on for a very long time. And these words, urban and rural, come from classical Latin words. So the urbs is the city, and the rus, the rural, which becomes a rural, is this idea of open space. So what is the rural then? When we take the linguistic evolution of the concept, we see that the relationship implied is never equal. And this gets us back to this point about power relations. Because the city, what they call the urbs, is the object, and the rural is always the other. And this idea of othering is very important in sociology. But the rural is the other. So the rural is always what is not the city. It is always non-urban. So we always define it in relation to the urban. So it's the open space beyond the city. So in your own languages, do you have a distinction between rural and urban, and does it hold similarly? I'd be very curious to see in the chat, or maybe Dr. Aziza, you can, Kota, am I saying that right? Kota? Desa.
It's kota and desa.
Kota and desa.
Yes.
And do those have similar relational meanings? Can you define kota without desa?
I'm not sure about the meaning, but yeah, desa.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, actually, we don't know the how they say why it's called kota and why it's called desa, like in Latin. Yeah.
Yeah. And are you able to define one without the other? Or do you also in your language, are you stuck in a relational or a dichotomy a bit?
Kota, we always talk about the technology. The technology and also the number of population,
Yep.
and also where the center of the government, yeah, the governments and facilities.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
more
makes sense.
facilities in, yeah. I know, and maybe in Netherlands, the facilities not too, yeah, too different between rural and urban. But maybe in Indonesia, the facilities is so different between, yeah, between rural and urban.
Hmm. I
Yeah.
can tell you, yeah, in the Netherlands, not so much, but I'm originally from Canada and
Mhm.
obviously also very different. But
Yeah.
for us, the difference between rural and urban facilities is huge.
Mm.
Yeah, very distinct. So in this case, and I was just in Iceland, and there
Mhm.
also the distinction between the rural and the urban is also very big. Yeah.
Mm.
So what I want to explain when we talk about rural from a sociological perspective is recognizing that at least in English, but maybe also as I'm hearing in your languages, that we that we always need the other reference. Excuse me, I'm just gonna cough for 1 second. Yeah, we can only understand what is rural by understanding what is urban. And we get stuck in these dichotomies quite a lot, at least in English. So we might say that to understand what rich is, you need to understand what poor is. Because if you don't have that opposite, then it's really hard to know what the other one means.
Mm.
Or, for example, dirty and clean. It's really hard to know if something is clean if you don't have an idea of what is dirty. And we use this same thinking with rural and urban. But from a sociological perspective, this comparison is important because historically the rural has always been less than the urban. Just like clean is usually better than dirty and rich is usually better than poor. The urban has always been more of a focus, more interesting, more technology, more infrastructure, more creativity even, and the rural has always been slower, at least in our sociological framing of it. But this is changing and sociologists have tried to change this. And I apologize for this slide because indeed the text is a little bit small and it's not important to understand this, but just to know that how, as a discipline, we approach the rural and social sciences has been changing. So really in the 1980s, we used, especially in geography and planning, which is quite linked to sociology, there's a very functional idea of rural. And this idea was that rural communities are bounded spaces, so defined by landscapes or physical characteristics like the small population or the fact that it's agricultural. And it's a very functional approach to the rural. It's a very descriptive approach. At the same time, the more traditional sociologists and anthropologists were taking a more sociocultural approach. So it was saying that rural societies are not necessarily defined by these physical characteristics or these population sizes, but more about cultural characteristics or values and behaviors. So maybe you guys have some ideas of what the typical rural behaviors are in some of the regions where you're working. Um, but we have a lot of stereotypes. Maybe you're familiar from American movies about, the rural being slow and people being a particular way, and then the city being very different. But the sociologists at this point were very interested in defining rural through these cultural characteristics. Then a little bit later, there was more debate, and in the 1990s, rural became focused as a locality. So using this idea of place. And this was more of a political economic concept. So if we have geography and sort of territory as the first one and cultural characteristics as the second one, in the 1990s, you see a big focus on the political economic concepts. So these are defined by characteristics associated with collective consumption or primary production, but also wider political and economic structures and processes. And this was very influential in the 1980s and 90s. Now moving to the next slide. So moving through the 1990s, again, you see that sociology takes on a social representation approach to the rural, and we use this sort of the rise of social constructivist concepts, and we're going to focus on these a bit more in this lecture. But the rural was seen as a social construct or a state of mind that is produced through the way we talk, through what we do, through our practices, and through the representation of places and giving them certain meanings and appearances and values. So we have an idea in our head, usually, if we close our eyes and think of what a rural community looks like or what it means to be, quote, rural, we might all have a nice idea that's quite similar. These are our shared discourses, our shared social constructions of what it is to be in the rural. And through this approach, there's this idea that there's not then one true idea of the rural. There's no objective rural, but different ways that people socially construct rurality. And this becomes very influential coming out of the sort of post-structuralist and social constructivist work in the 1980s through to the 1990s. And then coming up again in the early 2000s, there's another challenge to this evolution and these debates that are happening. And this is seen more as rural places as hybrid. They're assemblages of diverse human and non-human components, and this messy tangle, this net of social relations that actually moves beyond the local space. And I find these last two debates the most helpful, at least from my own perspective as a qualitative rural sociologist, to understand and to analyze what's happening in rural communities. So this other one is about really trying to make sense of how the rural is an assemblage or entangled with different relations outside of the locality itself. So just to summarize those two last slides, why I think it's important is it shows you that there's a healthy debate, like in all science, there's a very healthy debate around these concepts and around how they're understood. And there's this constant evolution and progress in how we understand and use these concepts. And I don't think any single one of these concepts or approaches to rural within sociology is better or worse than the other. They all have great benefits, but also limitations. What's important, I think, to take away is that depending on the kind of research you want to do, your own way of thinking about the world, and the research questions that you have in mind, each of these approaches might be more useful or less useful. And so becoming aware that there's this history and this ongoing debate is, I think, very, very important to keep in mind. Now, for this, the point of this lecture, for me, it's really about the cultural turn and these last two slides, the last two concepts and evolutions that becomes most important, at least in my work. So the cultural turn in the sociology of the rural is about a post-positivist turn. So it's moving away from sort of the objective nature of science. And it's really seeing this idea that the rural and the urban are social constructs. So these are their commonly shared discourses or commonly shared understandings about what it is to be rural or urban, so that if you came to the Netherlands tomorrow, I wish you could, it would be lovely because we are lonely due to COVID. If you could all come to the Netherlands, you would see Amsterdam and you would say, oh yes, that is urban. We would all share that construction. And you could go to Wageningen and on the way you would say, oh yes, no, that is rural. And then when you got here, we could debate whether this town is rural or urban, because this is an ongoing debate. And it's based a lot on how we have defined through our social relations, the urban and the rural. Now, from this approach to sociology as post-positivist, this cultural turn in sociology, there's no objective or inherent essence of what it means to be rural. But the rural is really brought into practice. So it emerges through our own practices and our own social norms and our own social conventions. And what we see studying rural communities is that people might act in certain ways to fit expected norms, whether you're in the city or the countryside. So maybe in the chat, you can just say yes or no if you've ever traveled from the city to the country or the country to the city and changed your behavior. For example, Have you dressed differently? Have you spoken differently? Have you behaved in a different way? For sociologists, we would expect that you would. And this becomes very important when you do work with communities. Not to say that you're faking it, but rather that you're adapting to cultural understandings and cultural norms between two different regions.
Okay.
Anyone want to share an experience that they have moving from the country? Oh, whoa, help. There. Moving.
Can I translate it in my language?
Please.
Ya, tolong dijawab. Apakah kalian pernah mengubah cara berpakaian atau cara berperilaku ketika Anda berpindah dari desa ke kota atau dari kota ke desa? Ya. Bisa dijawab dalam bahasa Indonesia. Nanti saya akan menerjemahkan. Pernahkah Anda merubah perilaku, kemudian mungkin cara berpakaian, gitu? Oke. Please answer. Okay. Yes. Yeah. They said, yeah, they change. Yeah, they adapt and they change their behavior, but not permanently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they have to adapt in their environment. Okay. Sarah Estefan said that it's permanently. Okay. Okay. Most of them say that they change something.
Yeah. Okay. And so this shows us that these concepts, this rural and urban concepts, it highlights, I think, the social nature of them and the way that we have in our own minds tried to understand the difference, because we don't respond the same way in these different places. And remembering that when we go to do work with rural communities is I think quite important, because there's a long history of people coming from cities to rural communities and bringing a whole bunch of assumptions with them, but also there's a whole history, a very problematic history of people from wealthy countries or from the global north coming and bringing their own sets of values to other countries. So it's, again, being really aware of the social constructions and the implications of those. And I would always argue, as a sociologist, paying attention there to relations of power, because those matter. Now, the rural, so to summarize a bit, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the rural is what the urban is not. And that puts us in a disadvantage, I guess, right? Because I don't know if you have a sibling who's perfect. Let's say you have a very intelligent sibling and your parents always say, oh, but you're never as smart as Sarah. Or why don't you run as fast as Sarah? Or Sarah's room is, my sister Sarah. Why isn't your room as clean as Sarah's? So you're always being compared to what you are not, right? And we can think a little bit as the rural as the poor sibling of the urban. And this, I mean, it's not so explicit, but it is. In the research shows us that underlying the way in which we talk and research and think about the rural, that there is, because of this binary, this dichotomy between the rural and the urban, there's always that one is better than the other. We're always trying to help the rural develop so that it can be as good as the urban. And maybe that's about giving them new technology, or maybe that's about getting them better internet, but it's always to make them catch up to the urban. And that's where I think we can do a lot of critical thinking as rural sociologists. So I like this quote: "The rural is commonly opposed to the urban. Rural is everything that is not urban, a vision that is not without ambiguity." So this is just to say that we need to focus on not just what is rural, but also recognizing this bias that we have towards the urban. And the precise boundary between the rural and the urban is always open to interpretation and dispute. So if we take this sort of more social constructivist understanding of the rural and the urban, then actually we don't have a very clear line between what is urban and what is rural, and it shifts. And that's very interesting for us as sociologists, also to understand how different people, where they put those lines. And what we often see is that those lines don't necessarily match the formal political lines. So when we think about the rural and the urban and this relationship, we're doing relational thinking. So this is a very oversimplified diagram, but I hope it starts to help show where we're going with relational sociology, because I do relational rural sociology. And you see that this instrumental understanding are all these points on the graph. And what we're trying to do is understand the rural in relation to these other dynamics. So we understand that things are connected. So if we take a relational understanding, it's about knowing a thing or procedure, what to do and why, and understanding relationships between things. And it's these lines that are actually the really exciting part of doing sociology, I think. It's really cool to understand what the circles are, but from my social constructivist perspective, it's really in how they link up that we get really exciting insights that can be very helpful for explaining phenomena or even proposing better policies. I hope that's clear. If not, please let me know in the chat. So if we come back to this idea that the rural and the urban, if we're going to be rural sociologists and we're going to study rural communities, then it's really important that we look at the rural and the urban in relation to one another and understand that these are social constructs, so they're shared understandings of the world, and that we can actually map and measure rural and urban spaces, but that we can never do this to capture some objective reality. That as post-positivist sociologists, we recognize that people are going to have different realities. And why I think that social construction is helpful for sociology, but also why sociology is hard, is because it can help us create our understandings of the rural and urban and capture other people's understandings. Because what we often find when there's tensions or conflicts is because of different understandings of these places. And what we also need to recognize from this approach is that because we see rural and urban as social constructs, they can be totally detached from their actual place in the world. So an object, a practice, or a custom, maybe an experience you've had, or a farmer, could be imagined as rural. But even if they're located in the city, for example. So you might, because of the way that we've constructed the rural, you might find the rural encroaching into the urban, and the urban encroaching into the rural. I can tell you that when I was in Iceland last month, I was in a very remote community. It was very hard to get to and very few people. But because of the new plane traffic, we had very urban experiences of a very fancy coffee shop where we could get really nice sort of lattes with designs on them and international food that we wouldn't have expected. So even though we were in a very rural setting, it felt a very urban experience. And maybe you've been to a location in a city like an urban farm where you felt also a sense of rurality. So this is, again, this idea of social constructs can be helpful, but it can also be limiting insofar as it takes things that we take for granted and it removes it from its context in some way. And the context becomes through the relations you have and not necessarily where you are. So please let me know if that's not clear, or maybe it's helpful that that is translated. I don't know. What do you think, Dr. Aziza?
Yeah, you can yes, go on. Okay.
Okay, great. So the last slide on rural-urban relations is that there are these different social constructs, and each imagine and understand the countryside or the city differently. And maybe you guys have some examples, you individuals have some examples of how the rural is portrayed in your own country and different images we have. I think Dr. Aziza already talked about technology and infrastructure and the distinction between, and I'm going to look for the words, desa and kota.
Yeah.
Desa and kota, but maybe you also have some other ideas, words that come to mind when you think about these different places.
Okay. Okay. Menurut kalian, apa yang membedakan desa dan kota? Yeah. Everyone can write in the chat room.
Yeah, or if you want to show your face, we'd love to see you.
Yes. Okay, the behavior, the culture, the lifestyle.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
Cara
That's
pandang.
cara pandang is how they the perspective, the habit.
Okay, very clear. Nice.
Pollution.
Pollution. Nice. Yeah. Yeah, we often associate the city with technology and progress, but also it's not as safe, and the countryside is maybe a bit, traditional and very safe and very clean often.
Emotion.
Emotion, yeah, nice.
Budaya is culture.
Okay, yeah, that's a beautiful word. So what we also see then is that because these are social constructs, and social constructions, we can also see that conflicts can arise. So in a particular place, or is a particular place rural or urban, it really can depend. And what does it mean for a place to be rural, especially in relation to development and land management issues? Because that's usually why we go in and do this community-based research, is often in relation to questions of resources or development, land management issues. So also the way that the rural and the urban are constructed and defined has important implications for the actual material impacts on people's lives. So I want to give a short example of, and this is my last rural sociology point before we go on to methods. But why do we care? Why do I find it important to take this relational approach? So understanding the rural in relation to the urban or to the global. And I think that we can look at a case study on poverty as an example. So if we took a relational approach to poverty, if we took just a traditional approach to poverty, we might just ask, why is this person poor? And then we have very few options, right? Maybe they're lazy, maybe they have bad luck, maybe they have bad health. But if we see that this person is in relation to the world, and we take a relational approach, then we might view poverty as a consequence of historical, economic, and political relations. We might say that they're living in an environment that is historically not had good access to infrastructure, or where the soils have become heavily depleted, so it's very difficult to have a productive agricultural income. We might emphasize that poverty and inequality is an effect of social categorization and identity, that it's not an individual fault, but it's also part of the way in which people are defined and the identities that are put on people. And we might also try and draw more explicitly on the experiences of poor people. And we might try and understand how they live in the world rather than coming down at a more top-down approach. So this is a bit to say that when we do community-based research, it can be very, very helpful to situate the people in the communities in relation to what's happening what has happened historically, but also what's happening around them. So no matter how much we really want to focus on the community, it is so important to see the community as embedded in wider relations, in wider forces, that community, no matter how remote and isolated, is still linked to the capital of the country, for example, and still linked to various markets and exchanges. And so always remembering that these are not strictly isolated. They might have cell phones in the community. They might all be on Facebook. They're seeing and they're engaging with the world. And we tend to forget this sometimes when we go into study communities and we become very, very focused and we forget this relational approach, which allows us to open up our sociological imagination and better understand what's happening. Any questions so far?
Okay, any question? Ada pertanyaan? Okay.
Comments?
Yeah, this from Fahmi.
Oh, yeah. Ask, is it possible in the future there will be no rural sociology, only countryside life, like only urban sociology? I hope not, because I would be out of a job, but I don't know. One of the questions I'm working on right now, everyone is obsessed with urbanization right now because everyone's talking, well, everyone, there's a big movement internationally and I think at national levels to try and understand the rise of cities. This idea that now more than half of the world lives in cities, and this number is, I think, expected to rise to 65% of the world's population will be living in cities by 2050. That makes the desire to understand the urban and to study and the urgency of understanding and urban shifts, whether it's demographic or from a more socio-cultural perspective, that makes that very urgent. But for me, I can't imagine the rural doesn't disappear just because most of the people move to the cities. And I also, for my own work, I'm very interested now in how we're going to feed those cities, because we might see very interesting advances in urban agriculture, but certainly nowhere near the scale that will allow cities to feed themselves. So the rural will still exist. The other point, I think, is COVID. Now, COVID is not going to change drastically the trend of urbanization, but what we are seeing is perhaps more opportunities for people to stay in their rural communities because teleworking is now becoming more accepted. Um, and we're also seeing that some people might move, if not rural, then to the peri-urban, so the suburbs of the, not, between the city and the countryside. But I do see, maybe I'm naive, I'm very biased because I'm passionate about rural communities, but and I would like to see them maintained. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, Fami. I think that there will continue to be sociology that is rural, but I think your question highlights very clearly why this relational approach is so important, because we really cannot understand the rural without understanding the dynamics of um, the city and vice versa. Let
Okay,
me know.
Jessica. Yeah, there is two questions, but someone asked me to transfer the question from you because yeah, one of my students, he is a veterinarian, so he's quite this
Ooh.
material is yeah, it's very strange for him. So he wants to ask you, how do we define rural and urban, and how can we know if a place is urban or rural? Yeah, I will yeah, put it in the chat. Okay. And
Yeah, I see.
yeah.
Well,
Oh yeah, yeah, this one.
yeah.
Danang, yeah.
So
Danang Rilo. Yeah.
to answer Ganan's question, there are many ways to define what is rural and urban, and there are standards that most national governments create, very clear markers. So often they're by population, about whether something is rural, peri-urban, or urban. And so the way we often formally define the rural and the urban can be looked up through any government website. What I'm arguing is that these formal definitions don't necessarily allow us to understand the dynamics of how people experience rural and urban life. And so I would say that we define the rural and the urban in relation to one another, and also we construct them through various discourses or various practices. But maybe if you're a veterinarian, then the most clear answer is that governments make very clear definitions of what is rural and what is urban, and they're almost always based on population density. And how do you know if a place is urban or rural? Again, usually the government will define that, but I think we can all recognize in our own way what is urban and what is rural. And we each have a sense of what is urban and rural. And that's what we as sociologists want to understand, is what defines these places, and how do we all know when something is urban or rural. So I would say you can formally know because of the way that it's defined in your country, but informally we culturally construct through our movies, through our songs, through our jokes, through our literature, through the way we talk about places. We also construct these indicators that allow us to know. And does rural mean poor? No, I would not conflate poverty and rurality. I gave the example of poverty because I think it's a bit easier to understand poverty because it's something we can all maybe understand a bit better. But poverty does tend to be high in rural areas, but we're also seeing very high rates of poverty in urban areas due to migration to urban areas. And with COVID, that's becoming even more clear. So I would not necessarily link poverty to rural areas, but recognizing that indeed capital and money tends to be concentrated in urban areas because of the connection of urban areas to the global political economy.
Many questions? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So Kepra wants to ask, can you describe the pull factors and push factors of urbanization in your country? I can, Kepra, if you promise just to write in the chat some from your country. Ours, well, the Netherlands is a weird country because it's so small, and it's very well connected. So I would say Wageningen is not an urban. It's a city by definition. So this comes back to the question: how do we define from Ganang? It's formally a city, but nobody who's been here, and some of you I know have been here, no one would think, ooh, big city. Yeah, but so because of that, young people, and it tends to be young people who are pulled from the country to the urban, young people don't necessarily have that same push and pull here because you can get every 15 minutes, there's a train that takes an hour to get to the big cities, even half an hour to get to the bigger city around here. So we don't see the same kind of migration. In Canada, we definitely see migration from the rural to the urban for many of the same reasons that we see all over the world. It's predominantly young people looking for jobs. It does tend to be a bit gendered, and that changes by country. So I've done work in India where we've seen that the pull to the city is really the women going in for domestic work, which leaves a lot of men in the countryside. But I've also done work in East Africa where we've seen that it's usually men who come in to do manual labor in the cities, leaving the countryside very feminized. I'm curious to know if there's similar gender trends in your country. I know we have a PhD student who graduated, a PhD candidate who graduated a few years ago, who studied China, and there it was also the men migrating for work to the country, to the city from the country, and that left a very weird dynamic, not weird, but a different dynamic in the countryside because there were no men left. So that also changed things. I hope, Kipper, that starts to answer the question. But what we tend to see is primarily people seeking financial opportunities and a smaller number looking for educational opportunities. But again, that's linked to financial. Noor, why is urban community more chill while the village isn't? What do you mean chill like relaxed or cold? Noor, I would like clarification. Chill like relaxed?
Nur Hanifah, maksudnya chill apa ya? Chill keren atau gimana? Nur Hanifah?
Lebih ke ramah atau dingin gitu.
Dingin.
Sorry?
Ya.
Why is maksudnya mengapa di desa lebih dingin, lebih sejuk gitu?
Mengapa orang-orang di desa itu lebih ramah daripada orang kota?
Okay. She asked, why is rural people is quite have a good hospitality than urban people?
Okay, no, it is chill. So that's an excellent. It's so good English that I was surprised because yeah, it's almost like slang. Super. Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I think that that really highlights this idea of the way we've constructed through society understandings of rural and urban communities. So there tends to be this idea that, you know, rural people are more open, they're more chill, they're more there's better hospitality, but I'm not sure that's the case. There's just maybe more opportunity to meet people when you go to rural communities. I think we also see the same, maybe to a lesser degree, I don't know, but similar dynamics in the city, but we've also constructed the city as closed and stressed and not trusting. I think in the Netherlands, for example, I live in a very religious area of the Netherlands. Hello, am I still here? Yeah. I live in a very religious area of the Netherlands, and this particular form of Christianity is quite closed. So even though it's very rural, it's not very inviting to strangers. Whereas when you go to a city like Amsterdam or Rotterdam, you see really more international, more vibrant, more open people. So I can tell you that doesn't necessarily hold here, but I'd be curious also, Hanifa, to know more about your experience and why you wanted to know this question about the Netherlands, because maybe you see that is the case in your country. But I would say that we tend to see this because it's been constructed that we have this idea that people in the country are more simple, more trusting, more open, but I don't know that we have the data to actually to back that up. There's a question about difference in environment like in Indonesia. I've never been to Indonesia. I hope one day I can come visit. We all have a lot of water. I think that's one clear difference. I can show you outside my window maybe if I don't ruin everything. Can you see outside my window?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have lots of trees, lots of bicycles, but the trees are all changing color right now. It's cold. I think you would find it cold. Our Indonesian students are always wearing many jackets.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah,
I think Ilyas Abdul's question has been answered, maybe? Is there any rural community in the developing countries such as Korea or Japan? Yeah, I've actually got a nice partnership in Japan. And there are rural communities, and because of the way in which the government has, at least what I've seen in Japan, is the government has heavily prioritized urban areas, and the rural communities have really struggled and really suffered. And you can see entire villages that have been abandoned now because they haven't put a lot of energy into supporting rural development. And what I think is so interesting about what I saw in Japan when I visited with Kyoto University is that the communities themselves are finding very creative ways of trying to rebuild. So not using the government, but for example, we visited a community where older people, it was all old people in the village, and they bought a bus so they could take kids to school because parents don't want to move to a rural community if they have to spend an hour every day driving their kids to school and an hour every day driving their kids back. And they knew they didn't have enough students to have a community school. So there's all sorts of really interesting ways that people in rural communities are responding to this sort of fact that they've been maybe ignored from a policy perspective. Oh, now this is a tricky question from Harit Septa Nanda Pratama, and I apologize if I'm sure I've said that wrong. The rural and urban have their own advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, I agree. I think this is a very personal question. In my dream world, I would live in a rural community, remote even. You would never find me. I would be living in the mountains. But for practical reasons, I like small towns because you have some of the village feel. The country, we've talked about, this nice feel of community in smaller towns, and people seem more polite. Yeah, I've lived in big cities. I've lived in Paris and Barcelona and Vancouver, and I like smaller towns. But I think it's very personal choice. Some people so this is Rusenda Pusparemi. Some people in rural areas have different mindsets with urban people. How to change their mindset? I'd really like to know, what that means, and if that's indeed the case. I think we tend to construct the rural as a bit backwards or maybe a bit anti-technology, but in my experience working in rural communities is that doesn't hold up. They have just as much desire for new technology as other people living in cities, where we tend to see more of a challenge is usually across age groups, and we tend to see more older people living in rural communities. So we also know that maybe, from when the internet is slow, it's very frustrating to use modern technologies, and often technologies are not so, or the internet is not as strong or as fast in rural communities. But my research is not about changing people's mindsets, but understanding why they have that mindset in the first place, and seeing, okay, so I could give an example where I've worked in rural India, and the community I was working with rejected a lot of farming technologies for their livestock. And from a outsider perspective, it seemed crazy, right? It seemed really, really crazy. Why wouldn't you want this technology? It will make you more efficient. It's really modern. It's really clean. But actually, when I looked and spent more time in the community, I really started to understand why they wouldn't want it. So, for example, the electricity is not stable. So it would really being reliant on this farming technology that needed power, electricity, would mean they couldn't use it when they needed to necessarily. And I do a lot of work around gender relations, and there is concern from the women that if this new technology came in, that maybe that technology would shift who did the milking, because the men use the technology, right? So maybe that would take the milk from the women to the men, and the women sell the milk, and that's how they get money for themselves to spend on their own families. So there was a real concern for the women that if you brought in these new technologies, they would lose some of their power and some of their autonomy in their communities. So I think people my experience has been that people in rural communities have very good reasons for being resistant to particular technologies, and that it's can be really, this is why I love doing community-based sociology, because you can actually go in and try and understand why there's this kind of resistance, and try and understand from their perspective rather than from our own. Well, my perspective is very urban. So yeah, I would take a lot of my urban assumptions about how technology is really good. I hope that answers that question. Oh, so many. I think Ida Handayani, your question has been answered about positive and negative social interactions, or maybe not, between villages and cities. Oh, so many.
You can choose which one is quite different from others. Yes,
Okay.
because some question is just like similar.
Yeah. So okay, I've answered that one. Social inequity in your country between rural and urban. I would say yes, there remains some social inequity in the Netherlands between the rural and the urban. Also because it's very, very expensive to live in the cities. But we also see that the urban poor is a really ignored demographic. So while there's maybe less access to social services in rural communities, the concentration of poor people in cities in the Netherlands is pretty shocking, I would say, for such a developed country. Yeah. So I think we see different forms of inequality and different impacts of inequality in the between the rural and the urban. So many questions. Why the customs in rural communities are still maintained? That's a really difficult question from Muhammad Iqbal Baihaki. Oh yeah. I don't know. I think part of it is um, again that that cities are these meeting points of diverse cultures, and to fit into the city, you tend to. So okay, I'll go back. I asked a question about whether you change when you are in the city or in the countryside, and everyone said yes, right? Because we behave differently depending on where we are, and that reflects how we construct socially ideas of what it means to be in the countryside and what it means to be in the city. And I think when people move from the countryside to the city, it becomes very difficult to maintain a lot of the traditions that you might have had. It might be very normal to dress a certain way in the countryside in a more traditional way, or to maintain a particular custom that doesn't translate into the way in which our cities are designed. So I think it's a lot to do about social pressure, and also the fact that there's a diversity of cultures coming together, and people try and fit in. I hope that answers it. It's really maybe not my area of expertise.
It needs a long
It's a
answer.
huge question. Yeah. Oh my golly. Okay, here's one from yeah. First of all, thank you for all these excellent questions. I'm really overwhelmed by them in a nice way. Hasyati Anisa, she wanted to ask about, or this person wanted to ask about, rural communities are often known as people who have cooperative activities, help to help. And why is so little done in urban communities? That's a great question. And this is a question that some of my colleagues are working on. Because again, what we see is, I think, a bias. When we look at what rural communities, we see people working together because we expect to see people working together. I also think because there are less people, then we have more clear social relations and maybe a more clear transfer of skills. And for example, if I have a tractor and you have a good kitchen to process all my vegetables, then we might share and work cooperatively. I think there's also, through the way that the global economy is structured and the impact that has on communities, there's an incentive for local people I know more about food, but for people to come together in rural communities to create cooperatives, to increase their bargaining power, to increase their strength, in relation to maybe middlemen who will take the food to the city, or companies who will buy it. You have more strength if you work together. But what we are seeing, and I can't tell you for Indonesia, but for Europe and North America, we're actually seeing a really strong rise in cooperative activities in urban communities. Whether that's through sort of food co-ops, where people buy into a cooperative and purchase their food more cooperatively, or through cooperative urban gardening. We're also seeing the rise of cooperative food sharing. So if I make a huge bowl of soup, a huge pot of soup, I can put on a local app that I have soup, and my neighbors can pay me €1 for the soup. And then they can come and pick it up at 5 o'clock if they bring their own container, for example. What I love about this work, and what I love about that question, is it's starting by uncovering these cooperative modes of working in cities. We're really starting to uncover what's below the water of the iceberg. I don't know if you're familiar with this idea of the iceberg, but when it's this big, the Titanic hit one, but we have these icebergs in the water, but actually the biggest part of the iceberg is under the water. And that's very true, I think, for the economy. So we see a very formal part of the economy, our jobs and taxes and our, our pay slips. But what actually sustains the economy is hidden. We don't tend to value that. And that's all the work done by women, all the work done, in your family, all the caring work that you do, all the little volunteer jobs. And what we're seeing is that by trying to look at these maybe not so traditional economic activities that actually sustain that whole economy, we can try and see what's happening, what practices people do, and especially around food. And we see that there's a lot happening in urban communities around cooperative activities, but they've just been ignored because they're not seen as important, because they're not financial. And that is maybe also an interesting link, that these, because the urban has more diversity, it's not just sort of where you go to make money. I know I'm simplifying terribly here, but then maybe some of those more cooperative relationships are more on the surface. I hope that's clear. How does the Dutch government develop the potential in the village? Oof, that's a great question. It invests a lot in infrastructure. It invests a lot in education, and I think in transportation. But the Dutch case is so strange, I think, at least coming from Canada, which is a very big country. The Dutch case, it's such a small, compact, dense country that some people say there's no rural areas in the Netherlands. It's just like the big cities and then suburbs or the peri-urban, because there's really nowhere to go that's far from a city. So I think that creates a very, I wouldn't say easy, but it's easier maybe than a big country to support, villages. Oh my gosh, so many questions. Did you see a nice one for me, Doctor? How do you avoid being individualized in the city or in your country? Wow, Bella, that's a great question. I have no idea. I'd love to know how you would respond to that. I don't know. I'm sorry. If you do find the answer, do let me know. I think there's many ways that we can.
I think it needs a special research for that.
Yeah. If you'd like to do your thesis on that, please do and send it to me. Okay. I think I've answered quite a lot of the questions. Should we turn now to methods?
Yeah, maybe you have to return to the material. Yeah.
Can you see the screen still?
Yes.
Okay. And do please keep asking questions in the chat, because they're fantastic. So now let's see, the second part of the lecture, well, part 4, but the second big half, you should now have some sense of sociology, that rural sociology is about trying to understand relations, social relations, and that from my perspective as a rural sociologist, these relations are constructed. in the way that we talk, in our movies, in our pop music, in all sorts of different ways. And that shapes how we understand rural communities, and it shapes how we understand urban communities. And we also always, because of the way that language works, at least in English, but it also sounds like in your languages, that we understand the rural in relation to the urban. Because yeah, we can only understand what's clean by understanding what is dirty, or what is rich by what is poor. So that's this relational understanding. So that's what we've done so far. And I take this perspective into my research when I go and do work in communities. And there are a number of methods we can use, and maybe those of you doing this qualitative research course will have much more in-depth knowledge than what I'm presenting here. But we can hopefully discuss it. But for my veterinary sciences and animal nutrition, this might be quite different than your methods. So I'm trying to meet a balance here. But I'm going to look at qualitative methods in this next part of the lecture, especially what it means to do qualitative methods in communities. So field research, we'll look at case studies very briefly, ethnography. Part of ethnography is, of course, participant observation and interviews. And when we think about doing community research, we think about whether we're doing research about communities. So if I want to know about a problem in a community, or maybe I've been approached by a community to answer a problem. So I'll be doing research for communities. And maybe there's more participatory research or action research that I'm doing research with communities. And these are all very fine approaches, but how you do your research and the impact of your research and the methods that you use will be really different depending on what kind of research approach you take in relation to these rural communities. Now, I say the word community, what do I mean? Again, sociology is fantastically frustrating for people because we take words everyone understands and we try and make them less understandable. So for a sociologist, there's a very clear distinction between community and society. So, and it seems like I've lost, okay. Anyway, a community is a group of people who interact with one another. So friends or neighbors. And the interactions are typically take place in a bounded area, like a neighborhood or a city. But we also see that there are communities online, for example. So you might have a really cool Instagram community where you really interact with people on the internet and you have sort of very shared values and very shared beliefs or behaviors. Now, this is really different from a society. A society tends to be a geographic collection of people. So, for example, I live in the city of Wageningen, so I'm in Wageningen society. Maybe I'm in Dutch society, but my community might be my neighborhood, so my neighbors, or my friend group or the university. So there's a distinction. One is really, society is really sort of about having a bounded society. It's about geographic, and community is really about sharing values, beliefs, and behaviors. So you might be in a particular society, but you might disagree totally with your neighbor and not really interact with them because they're very different. Maybe you've been watching the American elections and you can see the split between American society and the Democrat community versus the Republican community. Maybe that's a clear way. And we see a very clear split these days. So when we're doing research in communities, we start with a problem. That's really helpful. What do we want to know? And when we're defining our problem, we want to state as clearly as possible what we hope to research or investigate. And it can be really helpful at this stage of defining the problem to think about operational definitions. So how are we going to explain concepts that we're seeing in a way that's specific enough for us to actually assess the concept and test the concept? So as a qualitative researcher, I don't have the luxury of facts or numbers. I don't have anything objective. What I do have are methods that I can apply in a very consistent way and in a very transparent way to test theories or hypotheses and to collect data to do my analysis. So we use concepts as a way of giving us a frame because we need to define a problem and look at it from a particular perspective. Some of the questions that I have been asking in my research, I can give you some examples. So one of the problems that I have a student working on now in Ethiopia is also with pastoralists, so nomadic livestock herders. And there's this very important national policy to support rural communities to ensure food security. So they want to have this policy to help people get food, basically, in rural communities. And they do this in a number of ways. But all of those ways are about work for food programs. A lot of them are about work for food. And to be able to work for food, you need to have an address and a citizenship card. And we were interested in what happens when you don't have an address. How do you access these public funds? So our problem was when you have a community that traditionally moves, so they don't have a single address, how do they benefit or how are their lives impacted by a very strong policy that necessitates being in a single place? And we wanted to know if these nomadic migratory communities made homes in one place to access the money, or if they didn't access the food and money, or if they did something in between. Another project I'm working on is in South America, in the country of Chile, and we're very interested in how farmers are moving towards organic agriculture, because the problem there is that there are very high droughts because of industrial agriculture, and there's very high toxicity in the soil. And so there's been a new law implemented in Chile to support organic agriculture. And we wanted to understand how farmers transfer from traditional farming to organic farming, because that's not easily done. So these are some of the problems that we had. For that second one, the definitions that we use are around, the concepts that we use are around transitions. So a theory of social change. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't with the chat. So we have our problem. We've defined a problem that we're going to do with communities, for communities, or about communities. And so we move on to methods, and the problem is going to shape the methods. And the methods is just really a tool. They're rooted in philosophical traditions. So methods are linked to knowledge. It's about epistemology. So that's about what we know. And methods define how we design and plan our research. Methods are about identifying and making decisions about tools that we want to use for data collection. And it's also about writing. If we're looking at ethnographic research, then writing becomes a method in and of itself. And I'd love to know if there's any ethnographers, so let me know in the chat. Now, we talk about methods, but there's also methodology. And this is quite, these are often confused. So methods are the tools we use to collect data and analyze data, and those might be different. Methodology is how we justify our chosen methods. And that also means being very, very clear about the distinction between like what's good about the method and what's not so good about the method, because every method you choose will have benefits and limitations, and you want to justify those in the methodology. So the methods are really about the tools, and the methodology is about the theory behind why you chose the tools. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a qualitative researcher, but maybe many of you on this, well, now it seems like many of you are also familiar with qualitative, but for our non-sociologists, quantitative research has a purpose, which is description and prediction. You explore outcomes, and the aim is to also generalize to larger populations. So you might ask questions like how many, what's the correlation, what's the causality? This is different for qualitative research. Our purpose is also description, but also exploration and a different kind of understanding. It's about exploring meanings, experiences, and practices. It's often about giving voice to silent people. And it can be inductive or deductive analysis. So it's when I say inductive, meaning that I have all this data and I try and understand something and build theory or build conclusions from the data. So I'm doing it inductively, or deductively, I start with a theory and I use that theory to find out something from my data. So this inductive is very scary. It can be very, I mean, scary in a fun way if you if you like doing this kind of research. But when you go in to do inductive research, you're trying to really free your mind of all of your biases and all of the assumptions that you hold. And that's really difficult. And as a student trying to write a thesis, it can also be very scary because you don't know what you're going to come up with. So I really like doing inductive research, but I often make sure my students have a lot more experience with these methods before they're able to go and collect all the data and then build theory from that. Because it's hard. It's not, I wouldn't say it's much easier, but it's more structured to try and test a concept or use a concept through your analysis. So when we're doing fieldwork in communities, the first thing we tend to do is go to the field. And that's any place that's basically outside of the library, the lab, or your own workplace. Although in practice, your workplace, the library, and a lab could all be sites where you go and study things. But the field is you go out to your community you want to work with, and yeah, you link this very much to your research design. Now, in the social sciences, when we do field research, we do it to collect data through interactions with people in the field. And if you come from a quantitative background or a more hard sciences background, field research can be very hard to understand. I can tell you a personal story. When I finished my PhD, my husband's a physicist, and he said, "How can you finish a PhD? You don't have any data." Oh my goodness. Well, that was a huge fight because for him, data is numbers and spreadsheets and formula. For me, data is all of the notes that I'd been taking, all of the interviews that I'd been taking. And I'd gone out and done field research for 2 years to collect this data. So it looks different than traditional scientific data. Now, field research in the social sciences can also rely on qualitative and quantitative research methods. For quantitative methods, you might do surveys, questionnaires, for example, even very structured interviews. You might look at demographic data, but I'm a qualitative sociologist, so that's what I'll focus on for the last minutes of this lecture. Now, as we prepare for field research, we must remember that this is systematic and structured. So even if we're going in to explore different questions, it's really, really important that you have a good plan and a structured plan. But also recognize that when you get into the field, it can be very unpredictable. There's a lot of planning and organizing that needs to take place, but there's a real need to think about the ethical treatment of people and places when we go do research. The other thing to recognize is that fieldwork can be very uncomfortable. It can be very discomforting. It can be transformative. It can help shape you, but it's often a lot of learning by doing and experiential learning within a safe and partly controlled environment. But often we see that fieldwork takes us outside of our comfort zones, and that's often because we're asking questions we don't know the answer to, questions that inspire us, and that can be confronting. So if you feel a bit uncomfortable, that's also, your norms being challenged. And that can be, if it's in a safe and controlled way, that can be okay. Once we have our field research and our design set up, we might want to pick a case study. So if you have an idea of a case study that you want to do or that you've done, please list it in the chat so I can see. But a case study is when a group of people or also an individual or an institution or a cultural setting. So like I said, we've got this case study in Ethiopia of this pastoralist community. I've also got this case study in Chile with the organic law. These are situated now across many disciplines. Many disciplines use this case study design, and it uses different methods. So we might use observation, participant observation, interviews. We might look at particular artifacts. And yeah, let me know if you're doing a case study and what it is. We might also choose to do ethnographic research, and this studies a problem or a topic from a very specific community perspective. Now, we can use this community geographically, so like we used our definition before, but really focused on a particular site, so neighborhoods, maybe by ethnicity. So I might be very interested in the Indonesian community in the Netherlands. We might also take into account culture, history, and ecology. So if we're going to do a study of Indonesia, it might be very important to take rivers into account. I don't know, you'll have to tell me. Using cultural concepts, we help to try and frame and interpret our findings. So it's about trying to understand better what's happening in a particular community. So some of the questions that were asked about why are people more open in rural communities, or why are people more friendly in rural communities, or why do people not want to take up technology in rural communities? These are all really excellent questions that you could study ethnographically by going in and asking these questions and observing what happens. And you might find that the answers shock you, like they did, for example, in the case I told you about India. Well, that shocked me. My favorite definition of ethnographic research, though, is deep hanging out. And what is really hard but so rewarding about ethnographic research is it takes a lot of time, and you basically just have to hang out with people and get comfortable and become part of that group so that they start acting normally, like you're not there. Now, that's never a perfect system, but you want to kind of try and find ways to blend in so you can see people and try and really understand their habits and their view of life. So a key part of ethnography then is participant observation. This is maybe the most obvious, but also the most challenging, I think, of qualitative data collection methods, because as you're hanging out, you're doing this deep hanging out, you have to take notes and you have to take a record of this, and you have to translate these very everyday experiences into data. So that takes practice. It means it's really a challenge to capture what you see and experience and write it down. And so I often ask my students, how can you actually do participant observation? Because you're not just a participant, you're also observing as a researcher. There's also this idea of community mapping. I think some of you are already working on some community mapping from what I can see in some comments. I love community mapping. It's a tool to explore social relationships. For example, you can use mind maps, you can use physical maps like geographic maps, or you can start mapping social networks. And it helps get different kinds of data from research participants. Now, you might not directly try and affect change or challenge power relationships, but you start to build a better dialogue and a better understanding of community relationships. So here, this is a mapping I did in India with women pastoralists. And this experience that I've had doing this kind of work is that it really helps participants move beyond description to actually tell you what's happening. And so as a researcher, you should facilitate the moving from description, elaboration, and theorization. And in many rural communities, doing this kind of mapping can be so fantastic for people who maybe don't have a high degree of comfort with language or writing. You can see from this map that they're just drawing what they know, and that's really helpful for people who maybe are illiterate or don't feel comfortable talking. These are some other pictures I've taken off the internet of different kinds of mappings that you can do, and you can see that you can do this with one person. You can take the same map and have many people in a community map, or you can do this participatory mapping. All of them are great. There's also a number of open kind of interviews that you can do, and they range from very informal, so just talking to somebody on the street, to very structured, down to sort of questionnaires. And they differ in control, structure, goal, and stage of the research. So you might use informal interviews to get a better understanding of the field, and then you might use a structured interview to really target a particular question. Now, I'm aware that we're short on time, so I'm going to skip these. But in my last few slides, I want to just talk about how you choose your research participants. There's always gatekeepers, so it's important that you find out who's going to give you access to the field. If you go to a rural community, that might be the mayor of the community or the chief of the community or an elder, the priest or the imam. It could be somebody, the school teacher. It really depends. But identifying who can give you access and who can legitimize your participation is really important. There's also key informants. So these are people who know a lot about the culture and who can share information with you. And then there might be culturally specialized informants who have some competence in that local domain. So maybe they're another ethnographer or another researcher, or maybe there's somebody who's moved to the city and then moved back to the rural community who understands that the differences or the dynamics. So my general advice for interviewing is really, as much as you can, be prepared. Go understand the local context, understand the background of your participants, understand the relations of power and the conflicts and the history where you're going. Use the flexibility that the method allows for. Combine with participant observation, because all of us have probably been asked questions and we answer the way that we think people want us to answer, and not necessarily in the way that we really feel. And we can find really interesting contradictions between what people say and what people do. Make notes, as many notes as you can as soon as possible. Always ask for stories, anecdotes, and examples. So if someone says, you know, I think that this teacher isn't good for our community because they don't let us teach our traditional ways, or they're trying to bring these city ideas into our community, then ask, oh, can you give an example? Make use of pictures, artifacts, news, and events. And last but not least, listen. Your biggest friend when you're doing interviews is silence. People don't like sitting in silence. So if you sit in silence, they'll fill that silence with talking normally. And it can be very uncomfortable, but also very nice to get new information. Also, don't be afraid to make use of secondary data. A lot of communities now are over-researched. A lot of communities are very tired. A lot of communities are very sensitive in terms of their political status. So you doing research that on data that already exists can be very helpful. Now, my final point before we turn to the last round of questions is around ethics. Ethics when you're doing community research are so important. And I think that they're a subject I know in Wageningen that is not taught enough, not discussed enough. And I love this cartoon. Any questions about the results of the study? And this man says, I was in a study. I truly believe that as researchers, we have an obligation to inform people if we're researching them. Now, many ethnographers will disagree. They'll say, oh, but that will change, you know, what they say. But I truly believe that that research integrity and truthfulness should be at the core of qualitative research, especially because, yeah, we want to maintain strong relations for future research. Now, the Sociological Association of America has developed a code of ethics, but it's about maintaining, I wouldn't say objectivity, but I would definitely maintain integrity in your research. Respect people's rights to privacy and dignity. So if they say, please don't take a photo, or if they say, please don't include this in your research, please don't. You always protect your subjects from personal harm. That means you respect their confidentiality. You always seek informed consent. You acknowledge collaboration and assistance. So if you're a research assistant, you should also have your space in this project. And you always disclose if someone's funding the research. But my main rule of thumb is that your primary responsibility is to the people who contribute to your research, and your primary responsibility is to protect your participants. I see a hand has been raised. Would you like to say something, Kusnul
Okay.
Tegu? Yeah.
Anyone?
I see a hand is raised. Yeah.
Who's Nur?
No, maybe it was a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, especially for master students. Yeah. Yeah. This is a very, yeah, it is for you actually, because you are enrolling this qualitative research
Yeah.
methodology. Yeah. Any question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just say for all the master students,
Okay.
research is something you learn by doing. So you will not get a perfect research the first time, and you'll never get perfect research. I think all of the professors on this call can share this. We still strive for the perfect research, but it's about, especially when you're learning in your master's, it's about process, and it's about learning these tools and learning the craft. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of your faces in the chat. And yeah.
Okay, open your camera, please.
Hello,
Everyone?
faces. Nice to see people.
Yes. Okay.
I'd love to hear what.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There is a raise hand, Dorosta Dinika.
Oh, I see two people with Dorosta Danica.
Okay. Anyone who wants to ask something? Yeah, especially for master students. I know you your background is varies, and yeah. Okay. Yesterday, someone messaged me that he said that I want to have a research how to develop my community, society. Yeah. The point is how how to find the best methodology to help my community. Yeah,
That's a huge question. I would say go back to the problem. So what problem does the community face in terms of its development? Is it an economic problem? Is it a social problem? And you cannot answer all of the problems of your community as a researcher. But I think before you can choose your method, you really have to understand what part of the problem you want to study. So maybe is that student here? Maybe they want to explain a bit about the topic.
Yeah, I forgot his name.
Yeah, that's okay. So let's say it's there's conflict around between the youth and the senior people in the community around cell phones. I don't know. And the youth say that we really need cell phones because then we have better information and we can have better knowledge when we negotiate the price of our food. And the elders say, yeah, but you're spending your whole time on Facebook, and we don't like you're getting all these new values. Then you might want to ask a question related to that, and that might involve I think then the method that I find very helpful here is the mapping method. So going in and working with different groups in the community and trying to get an understanding of how that different problem is understood, but also the different opportunities and challenges that people see. Another method that might be very helpful is forecasting and backcasting. So we use this also a lot in community development. I've used it in many countries. And what you ask is, okay, well, you're in your community now, but let's think about your community in 50 years. What does that community look like? And it sounds very simple, but it's a nice method because it allows people to think about the future that they want. So you already start from something positive, and that gets you out of this internal challenge of the politics of today. So let's say we all want a rural community with a good school and good transit to the city, but where young people want to stay and live. And okay, so what do we need to get there? And then you forecast what you want, and then you backcast the steps that you need to get there. And you also highlight what are the blockages, what are the challenges to achieving this future goal. What that does now it's not reality, but what it does methodologically is identify for you as a researcher where there's common goals and where there's different goals, and where there's common vision and where there's different vision, and where there's a common understanding of what the community challenges are. So you might learn that the women have a very different idea of what the challenges are than what the men do. Or you might learn that the youth have a very different understanding, or the people living on this river have this understanding. And I think that's also a very nice way of starting to then honing in and choosing the part of the problem you want to focus on to moving it forward. So I would say that in doing community-based research, the most important thing is opening up good lines of communication with the community to identify what problems they want and to understand the future that they want. And those are going to be competing futures in many cases. But what's so important is that we don't take our own mindset and apply that to the community.
Okay. Okay, is there any questions, students?
I loved all your questions, so I hope there's many.
Okay. Yeah. For example, if we have conflicts in the community, yeah, and we do some research there, and what if we cannot find any solution for the conflict? Is it worth it?
I struggle with this. One of the things I struggle with sociology is that we're not necessarily good at providing answers. I think methodologically and theoretically, we're interested in understanding the relationships behind those conflicts. And maybe it's not the best discipline for giving us the tools to solve those conflicts. At the same time, I think that to solve these conflicts, sociology is so important because it gives you insight into the diverse reasons for conflict. And we might, on the surface, see one kind of conflict and assume it to be one thing, but actually by living in the community, by doing participatory mapping, by doing a forecasting and backcasting exercise, we might see that there's actually a really different cause of the problem, and that's something that happened 20 years ago that was never resolved. That might not be obvious for new people coming into the community. And so I would say that trying to understand the roots of conflict is always very important and really key. And that actually there are some conflicts in society that nobody can overcome because there's just a dynamic of people having different visions of the world, and that's always going to happen. I would say it's still very much worth studying and trying to understand, because that deeper understanding can contribute to a resolution. But I'm not sure it's the job of the sociologist or of especially the student to try and resolve those conflicts. So I would say understanding, absolutely, but resolving, that's a lot to take on, and that should really come from leadership in the community, people who have the political will and the legitimacy to do that. That would be my instinct, but maybe that's very different in a different context.
So if we just give a recommendation, is just enough? Or,
I say understand, but understand that as one sociologist, you can't fix the problem. And it's not our job. Our job is to better understand the problem. And that's why so many people are frustrated with sociology, because we refuse to give answers sometimes, clear answers. We say this or this or this. And that can be very frustrating for people who want to know, yeah, but what do I do? Yeah, well, I don't know, but I can tell you that these are possible options. I think, in my experience. Yeah. I'm curious what you think from your experiences.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So yeah, now I think I'm happy with your answer because some of my colleagues say that so what is the solution for that? Yeah, we have many years conflict in our society, but when we do research we cannot solve the problem. And I'm happy with your idea.
But I do think that this research helps people whose job it is to solve the problem.
Yeah, for decision making.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But also so many of these community conflicts that from my perspective, the change really has to come from the community. We know these top-down solutions tend to not work and maybe even have more conflict. So yeah, maybe not a satisfying answer, but
okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Any questions from the students or master students? From master students?
oh,
Okay.
I see a nice cat.
That is the last question from Sylvia. The perspective of rural and urban communities is different. If this happens in a community when there is a big conflict, but people in a community feel they don't care, what action should be taken? Maybe this is the last question.
That's a huge question. Yeah, perspective and role. So yeah, I think there's definitely, so are you thinking maybe a conflict over resources? Is that where this is coming from, Sylvia? I don't know if you can explain, if you feel comfortable. You can also explain in your own language and it can be translated.
Oke, Sylvia, maksudnya apa Sylvia pertanyaannya? Sylvia ada di sini? Sylvia?
Maybe she's shy.
Yeah.
No problem.
Okay. Yeah, I think the time is enough. And Jessica, do you have just a closing statement for my students and also for me? Yeah, to make it better.
I know. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you and to work through some of the very difficult questions that were asked. And I hope I can keep in touch with all of you to hear how you're going to be implementing your qualitative research in communities. And I guess my last question is just again to really listen to what people in communities have to say, because that's so hard to do. It sounds so obvious, but it's so hard to really listen and to listen from their perspective and to situate that work, what you're hearing in relation to the other things that are happening around. And I think that's exactly coming back to the first quote that I gave you, that's why physics is easy and sociology it's really hard, because you have to think outside of these linear frameworks. So I wish you lots of luck, because it's such an exciting approach, but it can also be very confronting. And it's cool to see so many people working on these topics. And just thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all and answer some questions.
Yeah, thank you for the great materials. And okay, guys, say thank you to Prof. Jessica.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Miss.
Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Okay.
Good luck.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Terima kasih, Bu.
Terima kasih, Bu.
Oh, terima kasih. Matur
Terima
suwun.
kasih, Bu.
Thank you.
See you, Miss.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zita. And I will send you the PowerPoint if that's helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you.
See you.
Ya, oke. Ya, jangan lupa belajar siap-siap untuk UTS ya. Okay.
Ya, Bu.
Baik, Bu.
Insya Allah kita gunakan Google Form ya. Saya belum tahu nanti bentuk UTS-nya bagaimana, yang jelas harus belajar.
Siap, Bu.
Ya, Bu.
Thank you everyone. See you next time ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Salam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih
Jangan lupa
banyak,
absen
Ibu.
ya.
Iya, Bu.
Iya, Bu.